Mississippi River, 1982. Steering fails at full speed. 2 ships on collision course. The bridge telegraph was ringing for stop engines but the vibration under my feet told me the main engine was still pushing us forward at 12 knots. Through the porthole, I saw the muddy water of the riverbank rushing toward us way too fast. We weren't turning. We were sliding sideways, dead in the water, directly into the path of a massive loaded tanker coming downriver. The collision alarm started its deafening pulse, cutting through the humid air. 3 decks down, in the steering flat, all hell had broken loose. The high-pressure return line on the starboard ram had burst wide open at the weld. Hot hydraulic oil was spraying out at 2,000 psi, hitting the steel bulkhead like a fire hose. The pressure dropped to 0 instantly. Without that oil pressure, the massive steel rams couldn't hold the rudder. The force of the river current grabbed the rudder blade and slammed it hard over to port, locking it there. This happened in the summer of 1982 on a rusted 40,000-ton bulk carrier entering the Mississippi River toward New Orleans. I was the second engineer, young and eager, but I had never seen a river this angry before. It was typical of New Orleans weather, hot, sticky, and heavy. You could feel the sweat running down your back just standing still in the control room. We had been on duty for 6 hours navigating the pilot stations, and everyone was tired. The coffee in the control room was cold and tasted like burnt rubber, but we drank it anyway to stay sharp. The chief engineer was a tough old man from Scotland who never raised his voice, even when things went wrong. But on this day, I saw his knuckles turn white. When the alarm first sounded on the main panel, it wasn't the general alarm. It was the specific high-pitched buzzer for steering gear, low level. I looked at the chief. He didn't say a word. He just dropped his clipboard. The sound of that clipboard hitting the metal desk was the last quiet thing I heard for hours. "Get to the steering flat," he barked. I grabbed my flashlight and ran. The engine room is a loud place, full of the rhythmic thumping of the pistons, but as I ran aft, the sound changed. It went from a thump to a hiss, a loud, angry hiss. I scrambled up the ladder, my boots slipping slightly on the grating. The air got hotter as I climbed higher toward the steering compartment. I could smell it before I opened the watertight door. It was the thick, sweet, suffocating smell of hot hydraulic oil. Before I tell you what we found behind that door, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us reach more sailors who remember the old days of shipping. Thank you. I spun the wheel on the watertight door and shoved it open. A mist of oil hit me in the face instantly. It coated my glasses. I had to wipe them with my greasy thumb just to see. The floor plates were already covered in a slick, dangerous pool of golden fluid. The starboard pump was screaming, a horrible, grinding mechanical shriek, because it was running dry, sucking air instead of oil. I tried to step inside, but my boot hit the slick oil and I went down hard on one knee. I felt the bruise instantly, a sharp pain shooting up my leg, but I ignored it. I scrambled back up, grabbing a pipe for balance. The pipe was scalding hot. I let go and cursed. "Kill the pumps!" the chief yelled from behind me. He was standing in the doorway assessing the mess. I waded through the oil. It was soaking into my socks. It felt warm and gross against my skin. I reached the starter panel. My hands were slippery and I couldn't get a grip on the switch immediately. I had to use the rag from my back pocket to grab the handle. Clunk. I killed the starboard pump. Clunk. I killed the port pump. The screaming stopped. Now the only sound was the terrifying groan of the rudder stock. The ship was still moving and the river current was fighting the rudder. The massive steel tiller arm was banging against the stops. Bang. Bang. Shaking the whole stern of the ship. It seemed impossible. We had no hydraulics, a stuck rudder, and a tanker bearing down on us. But you won't believe how a simple chain block and a sledgehammer became our only hope. "Check the tank level," the chief ordered. I slid over to the sight glass on the expansion tank. Empty, bone dry. The burst pipe had dumped 500 liters of oil into the bilge in less than 2 minutes. "We have no oil, Chief," I said. My voice sounded shaky even to me. "And we have no steering," he replied, his face grim. "The bridge says we are drifting into the channel. We have maybe 4 minutes before we hit that tanker." 4 minutes! That's not enough time to fix a weld. That's not enough time to refill a system. We needed to center the rudder manually. If we could center it, the ship might track straight enough to run aground softly on the mudbank instead of smashing into the oncoming traffic. But the rudder stock weighed tons. The forces on it from the water were immense. The hand pump? I asked, looking at the emergency manual pump in the corner. Useless, Atolwas, the chief spat. The line is busted. The manual pump feeds the same line. He looked around the room. It was a steel box, trapped with the smell of disaster. His eyes locked on the overhead beam. There was a heavy-duty chain block hanging there used for maintenance. Get the chain block, he said. We have to pull the tiller arm back to center mechanically. I looked at the tiller arm. It was a massive chunk of solid steel, currently jammed hard to port. The hydraulic rams were dead weight. To move that arm, we would have to fight the river itself. I dragged the chain block across the rail. The chain rattled loudly, echoing in the small steel room. It was heavy, maybe 50 pounds. I lifted it up, my muscles straining. My uniform was soaked in sweat and oil. I hooked it onto the pad eye on the bulkhead. Hook the other end to the tiller, the chief shouted. He was already grabbing a second chain block. From the port side, I lunged for the moving tiller arm. It was dangerous. If the rudder snapped back, it could crush my hand against the stop. I waited for the rhythm. Bang, pause, bang. During the pause, I threw the hook onto the eyelet of the tiller. It clicked into place. Heave! I started pulling on the chain. Click, click, click. The gear inside the block took up the tension. The chain went bar tight. I pulled harder. The chain dug into my palms. I wasn't wearing gloves. There had been no time. The metal bit into my skin. Nothing happened. The rudder didn't budge. The force of the Mississippi River pushing against that rudder blade was stronger than I was. It's not moving, I yelled. The ship took a sudden roll. We were caught in the wake of the passing traffic or the current swirling around a bend. I lost my footing again, sliding across the oily deck plates. I slammed into the hydraulic power pack, winding myself. The phone on the wall buzzed. It was the bridge. The chief didn't answer it. We knew what they were saying. Impact imminent. The lights in the steering flat flickered. The main generator was straining as the bow thruster tried to push the front of the ship, but it was useless against the current without the main rudder. We were sliding broadside. I could hear the horn of the other ship now, a deep, mournful blast that vibrated right through the hull plates. It sounded like a funeral march. We need more leverage, the chief roared. The bypass valves. The rams are fighting us. I had forgotten. Even with the pumps off, the hydraulic fluid trapped in the cylinders was creating a hydraulic lock. We were trying to compress fluid that couldn't move. We had to open the bypass valves on the cylinders to let the oil flow freely from one side to the other. But the bypass valves were located right under the burst pipe, right where the hot oil was still dripping, and they hadn't been turned in years. I crawled under the pipe. Hot oil dripped onto my neck, burning like bee stings. I wiped my hands on my shirt, trying to get a dry grip. I grabbed the valve wheel. It was stuck, frozen by rust and paint. It won't turn, I screamed. The sound of the other ship's horn was constant now. We were seconds away from a catastrophe. I was on my knees in the sludge, desperate. My hands were wrapped around the iron wheel of the bypass valve, but it felt like it was welded shut. Rust and layers of old paint had glued the threads together. Every second I struggled with that valve, the ship moved closer to the tanker. I tried to grip it harder, but my palms were too greasy. My hands just spun around the rim of the wheel, achieving nothing. I wiped my hands on my boiler suit again, but the fabric was already soaked through. It was useless. Use the F key, the chief shouted, kicking a heavy steel valve wrench across the deck plates toward me. The tool skidded through the oil and hit my boot with a dull thud. I grabbed it. It was a solid bar of steel, shaped like an F, designed to hook onto the spokes of a valve wheel for leverage. I jammed the jaws of the wrench onto the wheel. It slipped off the first time, banging my knuckles against the sharp edge of a pipe flange. The pain was sharp and hot, like a burn. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. I tried again. This time the wrench bit into the iron. Hit it, the chief yelled. He was already working on the port side bypass, hammering at it with a brass mallet. Clang, clang, clang. I raised my boot and kicked the handle of the wrench with everything I had. Creak. A horrible, dry screeching sound echoed in the small room. The valve stem was turning, but it was fighting me every millimeter. I kicked it again and again. My breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. The air in the room was thick with oil mist and the exhaust fumes from the struggling generator. With one final kick, the valve broke free. I spun it open as fast as I could. I could hear the fluid hissing inside the block now, bypassing the cylinder. The hydraulic lock on the starboard side was broken. "Starboard side open!" I screamed. The chief was still hammering on the port side. "Port side is stiff. Come help me." I scrambled over the machinery. The deck was tilted now. The ship was heeling over as the current pushed against our broadside. Gravity was fighting us too. I slipped, catching myself on the hot electric motor of the pump. The heat radiated through my gloves. Together we grabbed the chief's valve wheel. 2 men, 4 greasy hands, pulling in unison. 1, 2, heave! The valve groaned and spun loose. We had opened the bypasses. The hydraulic fluid could now flow freely from one side of the cylinder to the other. But this created a new, terrifying problem. Without the hydraulic lock holding the rudder was now flapping loose. The river current was the only thing controlling it. If the current pushed it harder to port, we would turn sharper into the collision. If the current pushed it to starboard, it might swing violently and smash against the internal stops, potentially shearing the rudder stock completely off. The chief looked at me. His face was smeared with black grease, his eyes wide. "We have to make a choice," he said. "If we pull it to center with the chains and the current catches it wrong, the chain block might snap and take our heads off. But if we leave it loose, we have no control at all." He hesitated for a split second. The bridge phone was buzzing again. It was a terrible choice. If we engaged the chains and they failed, the metal shrapnel in this small steel room would be like a grenade going off. If we did nothing, the ship would almost certainly crash. What would you have done in that situation? Would you risk the equipment and your lives to try and force the rudder, or would you let the ship drift and hope for a soft grounding? Let me know in the comments. "Rig the chains," the chief decided. "We pull." We ran back to the chain. Blocks. The rudder was banging back and forth now, thud, thud, sloshing the oil on the deck like waves in a storm. I grabbed the chain on the starboard block. The chief took the slack on the port side to act as a brake. "Heave!" he commanded. I pulled the hand chain. Click, click, click. The gear mechanism whirred. The chain went tight. It vibrated in my hands, humming with tension. I felt the weight of the massive steel rudder transmitted right through the legs into my arms. It felt like I was trying to pull a truck up a hill with my bare hands, but it moved. "She's coming!" I yelled. 5 degrees! I pulled harder. My shoulders burned. Sweat dripped into my eyes, stinging like acid. 10 degrees! The rudder was coming away from the hard-over position. We were centering it. If we could get it to midships, the water flow over the rudder would stabilize the ship. The bow would stop swinging. We might miss the tanker. I looked at the rudder angle indicator on the wall. It was moving slowly towards 0. "Almost there," the chief grunted. He was leaning back, using his whole body weight to keep the braking chain tight. I allowed myself a second of relief. We were doing it. We were actually going to save the ship with just muscle and gears. Then the laws of physics reminded us who was in charge. The ship passed over a shallow patch of the riverbed, or maybe the tanker's bow wave hit us. A massive surge of water hit the rudder blade outside the hull. The force was instantaneous. Snap! It sounded like a gunshot, a literal explosion in the small room. The safety latch on my chain block hook sheared off. The hook straightened out under the immense load. The chain whipped back toward me faster than my eyes could track. It lashed through the air and struck the steel bulkhead inches from my face. Sparks showered down. The heavy steel block crashed to the deck, cracking a floor plate. "Watch out!" the chief screamed. Freed from the restraint, the rudder slammed violently back to hard over port. The crash shook the fillings in my teeth. The ship lurched heavily. We were back to square one. Actually, we were worse off. My chain block was broken, lying in a heap of twisted metal. The rudder was pinned hard over again, and we had wasted 3 precious minutes. I looked at the chief. He was staring at the broken hook. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. "The tanker," I whispered. "We're going to hit." The vibration of the oncoming ship's engines was audible now, thrumming through our own hull. We were drifting broadside, completely helpless with a broken steering system and no tools left strong enough to fight the river. "The chains won't hold," the chief said quietly. "The force is too high." We needed something stronger than a chain block. We needed a rigid link, something that wouldn't snap, but we had nothing. Just pipes, wrenches, and scrap metal. Then the chief's eyes darted to the corner of the room, to the scrap bin where we threw old parts. "The Strongback," he muttered. "The cylinder Strongback." I looked. It was a solid steel bar used for locking the rudder during dry dock, but it was too short. It wouldn't reach the tiller arm. It was impossible to fit. "It's too short, Chief," I yelled. "Not if we weld an extension," he said, "right now." "Weld?" I looked at the oil covering the floor. The room was a fire trap. "Chief, there's oil everywhere. One spark and we blow this whole room up." He looked at me, then at the door where the collision alarm was still screaming. "Get the welding leads," he ordered. "We have no other choice. Get the DC welder," the chief barked, "and the fire blankets. Move!" I scrambled out of the steering flat, my boots squelching loudly in the oil. I ran down the short alleyway to the workshop. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I grabbed the heavy welding rectifier. It weighed about 60 pounds. I dragged it by the handle, the rubber wheels bumping over the door combing. I threw a coil of welding lathes over my shoulder. They were heavy copper cables, stiff and awkward. When I got back to the steering flat, the chief was already scrubbing a patch of the deck with rags. He was trying to create a safe zone right next to the pool of hydraulic fluid. It was madness. We were about to strike an electric arc inches away from 500 liters of flammable oil. "Hold the blanket up," he ordered. "Make a wall. If a spark hits that oil, we burn." I grabbed the fiberglass fire blanket. It was scratchy and smelled of old dust. I held it up between the chief and the burst pipe, creating a flimsy shield. My hands were shaking. The chief jammed a welding rod into the stinger. He didn't even put on a welding mask. He just grabbed a pair of dark-burning goggles from his pocket. He dragged the steel Strongback bar onto the workbench vise. He grabbed a scrap piece of heavy steel pipe from the bin, a cutoff from a steam line, thick-walled and rusty. "Turn it on." I flipped the switch on the welder. The machine hummed to life, a loud 60-cycle buzz that drowned out the groaning of the rudder. "Zustaz set." Crack. The arc struck. Blue-white light flooded the room, blindingly bright against the dark, oily steel. The smell of ozone instantly mixed with the heavy stench of the hydraulic oil. Sparks flew like angry hornets. One spark arced over the top of my blanket and landed in the oil puddle near my foot. I stomped on it instantly. My boot heel ground it out before it could ignite the vapor. "Keep it covered," the chief yelled, never looking up. He was laying down a bead of weld as fast as he could. He wasn't trying to make it pretty. He was trying to fuse the pipe to the Strongback to make it 2 feet longer. I watched the metal turn cherry red. The heat coming off the arc was intense. In the small, unventilated room, the smoke from the burning flux was choking us. I coughed, my eyes watering, but I didn't drop the blanket. The sound of the tanker was terrifyingly close now. The vibration of its propeller was resonating through our hull plates. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It felt like the other ship was right on top of us. "Done!" The chief killed the arc. The extended Strongback was glowing dull red at the joint. It was ugly, a glob of molten steel, but it looked solid. "Gloves," he shouted. We both grabbed the bar. It was incredibly heavy, maybe 150 pounds now with the extra pipe. The heat traveled through my leather gloves instantly. It felt like holding a hot coal. We lugged it toward the rudder stock. The tiller arm was still banging back and forth with the waves. We had to time this perfectly. We had to drop the pin of the Strongback into the hole on the tiller arm when it swung past the center. "Wait for it," the chief breathed. Sweat was dripping off his nose and sizzling on the hot metal bar. Clang, clang. The rudder swung port. Then it started swinging back to starboard. "Now!" We thrust the heavy bar forward. The steel pin lined up with the hole in the tiller arm. I shoved it down. It didn't want to go. It was a tight fit, and the angle was slightly off. "Hammer!" I let go of the bar with one hand, grabbed the sledgehammer from the floor, and swung it short and hard. Wham! The pin drove home. The chief spun the locking collar on the other end, securing the bar to the ship's frame. The rudder was now physically pinned to the ship's structure by a glowing hot piece of steel. "Bridge, rudder is locked amidships," the chief screamed into the sound-powered phone, full astern. The effect was not instant. For a few agonizing seconds, the momentum of the ship carried us forward. I stood there panting, staring at that welded joint. The metal was cooling from red to gray, but it was under immense tension. The rudder was trying to turn, pushing against our improvised bar. Creak! The weld groaned. I saw a flake of slag pop off. I flinched, expecting the pipe to shear off. If that weld broke, the bar would become a missile, but it held. Then we felt it. The shudder of the main engine kicking into full astern. The propeller reversed, churning the water. Because the rudder was locked straight, the prop walk and the wash started to kill our forward momentum and pull the stern back. I looked out the porthole. A wall of black steel filled the view. The tanker. It was the Overseas Ohio, a massive American tanker. It was so close I could see the rivets on its hull. I could see a crewman on their deck looking down at us, his mouth open. We passed them with maybe 50 feet of clearance. In maritime terms, that is paint-scraping distance. The wake from their bow hit us hard. The ship rolled violently to starboard. In the steering flat, everything that wasn't tied down went flying. The empty oil drum slid across the deck. The welding machine toppled over. I grabbed the railing and watched the Strongback. The force of the wake hit the rudder blade underwater. The tiller arm jerked violently. Crack. A hairline fracture appeared in the chief's weld. "It's cracking," I yelled. "Let it crack," the chief yelled back. "We're clear." He was right. The bow of the tanker had passed our bridge. We were drifting away from each other now. The emergency astern maneuver had stopped our slide into their path. We were bobbing in their wake, dead in the water, but safe. I slid down to the floor plates. My legs just gave up. I sat in the oil, not caring anymore. I looked at my gloves. The leather palms were scorched black and shriveled from the heat of the bar. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't have made a fist if I tried. The chief walked over to the ventilation fan and turned it on to clear the welding smoke. He took a rag, wiped his face, leaving a streak of grease across his forehead, and looked at me. "Good weld," I said, pointing to the bar. "Ugly weld," he corrected, "but strong enough." We stayed in that river for another 6 hours. Tugs had to come out and tow us to the anchorage. We spent the next 2 days in the stifling heat of New Orleans replacing the burst pipe and flushing the hydraulic system. When we took the MacGyver bar off, we had to use a grinder to cut it free. The force of the water had bent that thick steel pipe by about 5 degrees. It showed just how much energy the river had. If we had tried to hold that with a chain block, it would have snapped in seconds. The rigid steel was the only thing that could have taken that load. We found out later why the pipe burst. Vibration. A pipe clamp had come loose weeks ago probably, and nobody noticed. The constant vibration of the propeller caused the heavy hydraulic pipe to flex just a fraction of a millimeter, millions of times, until the metal fatigued and let go at the worst possible moment. It's a lesson I never forgot. You can have the biggest engines and the most modern electronics, but a 50-cent bracket holding a pipe can still sink you. After that trip, the company installed high-pressure flexible hoses instead of rigid pipes on the steering gear so vibration wouldn't break them again, but I kept a piece of that welded Strongback on my desk for years. It reminded me that when the manual says impossible, you have to look at what you have, a welder, a hammer, and a piece of scrap, and make it possible. What about you? Have you ever had to improvise or repair with whatever junk you had lying around to get out of a tight spot? I'd love to hear your stories from the engine room or the deck. Drop a comment below, and if you enjoyed this story, please like the video. Fair winds to you all.